Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Warren Meyer, founder and president of Recreation Resource Management, a firm providing high-quality management of public parks and recreation for nearly 25 years. Warren, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bill. It's good to be here.
Warren, our National Park Service turns 100 this year, and it, of course, includes gems like Yosemite and the Grand Canyon, as well as many beaches, hiking trails, and historic sites. The budget for the National Park Service runs about $3 billion a year, and just like Amtrak and the Post Office, it not only loses money, but has racked up over $11 billion in deferred maintenance. Every year, a crisis is declared and a political fight breaks out over increasing the Park Service budget. You run a company whose business is to privatize the operation, but not the ownership of public parks, which remain the property of the government. How could this public-private partnership approach change the dynamic around the management of these beloved assets?
We waste a lot of money overpaying for basic things like cleaning the bathroom and mowing the lawns. The Park Service has a lot of sophisticated capabilities about managing wildlife and all these kinds of things, but they still spend 90% of their money mowing the lawns and cleaning the bathroom. And you've got civil service people with civil service pensions working all year at seasonal jobs, and you end up with enormous cost structures in the agencies to do very basic things that could be done much cheaper by private industry. And what happens with that is to keep these parks open, we spend all our money to overpay to clean bathrooms, and that's how we get the deferred maintenance. We end up with billions of dollars of maintenance that just doesn't get done.
It reminds you of the pre-bankruptcy General Motors where the guy mowing the lawn was making $70,000 a year.
It's incredible. And it's not just that. It's interestingly, the government really mismatches people to park management. They hire all these people with environmental degrees that are very passionate about managing wolves, right? But they're not passionate about cleaning the bathroom. They're not passionate about mowing the lawn. And they're not passionate about dealing with a customer whose campsite isn't quite hot and they're angry and you need to deal with their problems. And so we have the wrong people not only from a cost structure standpoint, but even to provide good customer service. A lot of these parks are run by law enforcement officers whose whole focus in the park, whose only metric is not customer satisfaction, it's how many citations did I write to my visitors.
Wow.
I mean, can you imagine McDonald's writing citations to people that show up in their parking lot?
Yeah.
It's just crazy. So there's a lot of reasons, both from service and cost, that we're able to better manage parks, to keep up with the maintenance, to provide good service to the public, and do it for a lot less than is currently being spent on government-operated
Well, if you
parks.
do an apples-to-apples comparison, you take two comparable parks, and you look at one run by the Park Service and one by a public-private partnership, how do the economics compare?
It's pretty staggering. We actually had the opportunity to do that direct comparison in Arizona, where we actually have as identical as two parks can be right next to each other, one run by the state of Arizona and one a Forest Service park operated by our company. And so we're able to look at it, and they're both bring in about $300,000 of visitor revenue. But for the state-run park, the state has to contribute another $300,000 of tax money on top of that $300,000 in visitor fees to keep that park open. And even then, it's on the cut list and is seldom getting the maintenance it needs to get. But in the park right next door that we operate, we take that $300,000 and we're able to pay all the expenses of the park. We're able to keep it maintained, and we pay the government almost $60,000 in rent for the right to have those concession rights, and I make my profit off of that. So for well under half the cost of the government, we're able to keep this park open, and we're actually able to keep it better maintained.
And for the taxpayer, instead of a cost center, it's a profit center.
Right. It generates money that's used in their other operations and to run some other smaller parks and areas. There's certain types of parks that we're actually currently not allowed to run. In this area of Sedona, they love us to run everything, but the money we pay actually is used for the government to run the rest of these parks that we don't operate and to cover their overhead and all those kinds of things. But yeah, exactly that. A park that costs essentially the taxpayers of Arizona $300,000 to keep open in addition to their visitor fees is generating $60,000 right next door for the U.S. Forest Service.
Well, if you add it all up, how many campgrounds and recreation areas are currently operated by public-private partnerships like yours, both national and at the state level?
You know, there's probably a bit over 1,000, but you have to be careful what that means. Lots of people are familiar with the National Park Service model. The National Park Service has concessionaires, but not like what we do. The National Park Service will have a concessionaire come run the hotel or a boat rental operation, or they'll come in and rent bicycles or something like that. But the government still operates the broader park and mans the gatehouse and cleans the bathrooms and all those kinds of things. And so there are a lot of those large concessions around the country. Most major national parks have those, but those are what I call traditional concessions, where the private industry only runs a tiny piece of the park. What we're doing is actually running the entire park, such that there's actually no government employee with a duty station on site. They're just not there. In fact, we often don't see them for months at a time. And so we have the entire responsibility for running the park. And parks in that kind of whole park management model for private industry, there are probably 1,000, most of them in the Forest Service. You wouldn't know it because they're not always thought of as an innovative organization, but the Forest Service has actually been a pioneer for this, mainly because they faced some economic issues 30 years ago that forced them to look for a dramatically different model.
Now, how does the Forest Service differ from the National Park Service?
On a national level, there's actually 4 or 5 U.S. recreation agencies. The National Park Service has parks. The Forest Service actually has much more land than the National Park Service. They have all these huge national forests. They're actually in a completely different cabinet department. Forest Service is in agriculture, and National Park Service is in interior.
But they also give logging concessions to private companies.
It actually was the death of logging about 40 years ago with the spotted owl and James Watt and all that kind of stuff that actually killed all the revenues in the Forest Service for recreation. The Forest Service campground program, the Forest Service has thousands of campgrounds. It has more recreation sites than any other recreation agency in the world. Those were all funded a lot by selling mineral and timber harvesting rights, and a lot of that got killed with the environmental concerns and competition from Canada and all that kind of thing. And so it was really that forced the Forest Service, when Congress said, we're not going to make that money up to you. You've got to find some way to keep these open, that the Forest Service really had to go looking for a very different model. And so that's why they really became a pioneer of this. But even within the U.S. government, there's the Bureau of Land Management, there's Game and Fish, there's the Corps of Engineers, or all have recreation sites. It's very confusing. And then your state has state parks, and then your county has county parks, and your city has city parks. We deal with many, many, many overlapping recreation authorities.
If the Forest Service provides such a good example of sort of wholesome cooperation, what accounts for the reluctance of the other services to outsource operations?
I would say that privatizing the operations of park isn't the last thing on these guys' preference list. It's off the end of the paper. It's only when absolute desperation hits, when the only alternative is to close the park, that we make progress on promoting our model. You will also notice that the types of agencies that we do well with, so we have a lot of concessions with the Forest Service, we have a lot of concessions with the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is the federal agency that runs a lot of the dams and power in the southeast. What those agencies have in common is that they have many, many different interests, of which recreation is only one, or is only just a minority of its tasks. And so it's less threatening that they're giving up operation of sort of recreation. But for the other agencies, there's a myriad of issues. One is self-selection of people. People who are skeptical of private solutions and more trustworthy of government solutions tend to self-select to go into government.
Sure.
So you deal with a lot of folks who are skeptical of private industry. The incentives don't work well. In most agencies, your pay and prestige as an agency leader is really determined by the size of your organization and budgets. And so reducing the size of your budgets or privatizing is not a good way to promote your personal career. And in fact, at state agencies, we actually almost had a deal about 10 years ago with the state of Michigan. But then soon after that, at a conference of state parks leaders, all the other parks leaders got on the state of Michigan parks leader and told them that basically you're going to be shunned if you do a privatization deal, because we're all trying to draw the line in the sand against this. And so there's a lot of incentives that hold sway, such that when we make our biggest progress was like in 2009 when state budgets were all going the toilet. Only then did they sort of really start calling us, because at that point the alternative was closure, and they were maybe kind of willing to talk to us if it might keep the park open. But things like cost savings or reducing deferred maintenance or saving taxpayer money honestly have no power in these discussions. I don't even bring them up.
So, Warren, we're talking about the privatization of various functions or the entire operation of various state and national parks. I had the pleasure several years ago of taking one of those whitewater rafting adventures down the Colorado River right through the center of the Grand Canyon. I mean, it was a spectacular experience, and it was extremely well run. I mean, basically, it was camping with servants. Our job was not to fall off the raft. How does the Park Service manage these various outfitters?
What they do is it depends first on their capacity. For example, in the Grand Canyon, they only have the capacity to have a certain number of outfitters. And so what they will do is they'll have a bidding process. And that bidding process will not only be you might bid what percentage you're willing to pay to the government, but what they're really supposed to do is pay less attention to the money and more attention to your capabilities and are you safe and do you run a nice operation and do you have a good history and do you have all your insurance and do you know what you're doing and all those kinds of things. And so the combination of that, you bid an operating plan. When I send in an operating plan for a campground, I'm talking about hundreds of pages of detail about how I run a campground, more detail than you might think even existed in campground management thinking. And then I also say, hey, and I agree to pay you this percentage of the revenues as my concession fee or my rent. So there's that bidding process for those concessionaires. They probably will only allow a few of them to win on. I think it's very competitive to get on something like the Grand Canyon. They'll have a certain number of years on the contract, and then the Park Service tends to be fairly hands-off with those. They'll monitor and make sure they're performing to the contract, they're providing the services, and if customers complain, they'll investigate. Theoretically, they're supposed to be more involved, but in reality, those kind of contracting officers quickly get downsized whenever the government has a downsizing. And so people would think that we would be thrilled that I don't have a contracting officer, but I spend most of my time running around the government trying to get answers for things because they've laid off everybody that knows how to work with us.
How are conflicts in park use priorities managed? I mean, for example, rugged outdoor backpackers and families pulling camp trailers looking for showers and cable TV hookups might not see eye to eye.
We have very clear expectations with the agencies we work with. Forest Service, for example, we know that they want to keep primitive campgrounds. They're not going to agree to electrifying anything. They're not going to agree to adding a lot of complicated services. So we don't even ask. All our agencies retain very strict control of any kind of improvement. I can't put two boards together without the Forest Service or my landlord's approval. So they take very strict control, which sort of puts the lie. The biggest criticism I always get is people come up to me and says, wow, when you privatize the operation of these campgrounds, you're just going to build a McDonald's in front of Old Faithful. And that's just, on the ground in reality, it's so absurd. I could spend 3 months trying to get a permission to put a safety warning sign up. There's strict control of what gets put up. But the Forest Service, for example, I know in advance they want things primitive. The Tennessee Valley Authority likes development, so I put in a lot of electrical connections and cable TV and things like that over there. So you adjust to your landlord and to your market.
Well, when you have one of these total contracts where you're managing the entire park, what keeps you from acting like a slumlord and just running down the infrastructure and sucking all the profits out?
Because nobody will come. I mean, honestly, it might have been possible 30 years ago if you had a unique site to do that, but this is the age of Yelp and review sites. I mean, why does Marriott clean the sheets? I mean, why does McDonald's clean the bathrooms? It's not because there's some government person standing over them making sure they provide the services. They provide it because if you go in to Marriott and they haven't cleaned the sheets, you're not going to go back to that hotel and you're going to go on TripAdvisor and write a scathing review.
Why is Chipotle in trouble?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The market provides, I mean, it may have been with fewer information sharing services 30 or 40 years ago, you could get away with that for a while, but you can't get away from that for 2 weeks in this market of TripAdvisors and Yelps. You've got to provide good service or people stop coming.
What is the difference between state-level management and national park management?
It's not a lot different. The state agencies, usually all they have is parks. They're a parks agency. And because of that, it's very hard to get them to discuss privatizing the operation of parks because 98% of their staff is the operation of parks. So you're talking about privatizing 98% of their life. And you try to have these conversations with them. Well, you know, your value add is not cleaning bathrooms. Your value add is about defining these lands and their uses and preserving them in some of the wildlife management. But you can't get there with that. They're very threatened at the state level when you come in and offer this model. So we've probably done less at the state level than places like the Forest Service.
Do you have to get engaged then in taxpayer advocacy and lobbying to get people aware of this?
We do almost no lobbying. I mean, the only lobbying we do is defensive. There's a couple key laws that really govern the operation of federal concession programs. One of them was just coming up for renewal, and I go up and testify on it. So we testify on them just to make sure that we as concessionaires aren't forgotten. And really, it's not even to get anything special. We just want to make sure that it's acknowledged that we exist and the law is written in a way that it doesn't do something stupid that suddenly wipes out our operation with the stroke of a pen.
Yeah, somebody slips a rider in and shuts down the whole thing.
But, companies like me, politicians aren't going to get anything out of me by trying to offer me something special. I mean, I'm not trying to seek it. I'm just trying to be left alone and be able to do our business. And every once in a while, I have to go to Washington just to remind people we exist and try to prevent something stupid from happening.
So, Warren, you wrote a piece in Forbes a while ago titled When Julia Tried to Start a Business. And I think Julia was one of the characters in the campaign narratives that were being used to promote the idea of cradle-to-grave care from the government. The stories in there are a bit of a composite taken from your own experience, but take us through that parable. I found it very interesting.
Begin with just an observation is somebody asked me once at an entrepreneurship class at Harvard Business School where I attended, and they were saying, what do you actually do with your day? And I said, you know what, I spend most of my time in the last 2 or 3 years in complete defensive mode, figuring out how to manage and reduce the impact of government regulation. And I know that sounds unbelievable, but for some reason we've just had an acceleration of this over the last 3 or 4 years. My first 5 or 6 years, I spent a lot of time thinking about how we're going to make the business better and where's my highest cost, and let's reduce that. And now, where's my second highest cost? And now, over the last 3 or 4 years, it's been, how do I manage Obamacare costs? Now, how do I manage these new minimum wage laws? Now, how do I manage this new minimum salary law that just came out of the Department of Labor? And it's just been a series of these management things. So when I saw the Julia story come up, which to remind folks, there was a little brochure, I don't know if it was Center for American Progress or Democrats or whoever put it out, that showed this woman, Julia, and how cradle to grave the government made her life better by doing this and that for her. And I want to say, geez, my day is all spent trying to evade the negative impacts of the government. So I wrote a Julia story where Julia is trying to get into my business, and it talks about, she loves the outdoors, and she knows she can operate these places better, but she has to immediately hit the incentives kind of within these agencies that don't necessarily care about costs and they don't necessarily care about services, but you're immediately banging your head against these bureaucratic incentives where they more care about keeping things in-house than they care about the quality of the taxpayer's cost reduction. And then when it comes to organize her business, you've got to set up all your tax ID numbers. I mean, if you look in my office here, I have whole file cabinets just with my government paperwork and all the different things I have to do every year. I have to file with all these state people. I have to file taxes with the states. I have to do my workers' comp with every state. I have to do my unemployment taxes with every state.
Welcome to entrepreneurship. This is what we all go through.
And so there's just this overwhelming mass of things I have to do. And now I have my new Obamacare reporting to employees that has to go out soon.
And you haven't groomed a single trail yet.
No, I mean, and so I'll just tell one of those stories. I spent my entire year 2 years ago trying to figure out how to convert 350 employees to all being part-time. I mean, talk about a completely useless, counterproductive task, but I was facing my employees, because they're seasonal recreation people, most of them are over 70 or almost uninsurable. In fact, most of them are on Medicare, but Medicare isn't acknowledged as an insurance plan for conforming with Obamacare.
It isn't.
And so I was facing $750,000 to $1 million in penalties if I didn't figure out how to make all my employees part-time. And so I spent a whole year doing that. That's what I did.
How happy were they to go from full-time to part-time?
And nobody was happy with it. And now I have 40 or 50 managers who don't make enough money now to be called managers anymore. And I had to tell them at our managers meeting last year, I said, by the way, all of you are going to have to start punching a time clock again. And they were irritated because for them, a lot of these guys are ex-blue-collar guys. I employ a lot of people that never even finished high school, and they're proud of themselves for having this salaried management job.
Sure. And
now I tell them, hey, sorry, it's back to time clock punching, and I'm going to have to carefully monitor all your hours because, Washington says so.
So, Warren, you would think with the over $11 billion in deferred maintenance piled up in our National Park Service, there'd be tremendous opportunities for guys like you with a proven model. What do you see lying ahead?
I continue to be optimistic because at least there's a solution floating around out there. I was just reading about the Washington Metro, the subway, and there's not enough money even to keep the escalators fixed because the government just always seems to build up these deferred maintenance accounts, and nobody knows what to do with the Washington Metro. There's just no money. Nobody can figure it out. But in parks, we have this big deferred maintenance issue in these parks, but we know what to do. We have over 1,000 parks managed by private companies like mine that don't have that deferred maintenance, that aren't getting that deferred maintenance. In fact, I invested several $1 million a year of my own personal money improving and fixing deferred maintenance in the parks I've taken over. So the good news is there's a solution floating around out there. The hard part is just getting the incentives right in the agencies to get them excited about pursuing it.
Warren, you seem determined to push ahead. Good luck with the program, and thanks for being on the show.
Hey, thank you very much.
That was Warren Meyer from Recreation Resource Management here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a partnership with Real Clear Politics, which the New York Times has called an invaluable tool for anyone interested in politics or public affairs. You can check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.